All right, so Craig, you sent me this homework and it looks really good, and you had a couple questions, so we'll just walk through that. First of all, you did a nice job in Part A here, graphing budget constraints with the information given, and also sort of plotting out her optimal consumption bundles in each case. If I'm being really picky, there's only one little mistake here, and it's at here, optimal consumption bundle C. Looks a little like it's not quite tangent. So make sure, do you see how this indifference curve is dipping a little bit into the budget set here? Just make sure that when you get that tangency that you're coming out, you're not dipping down below. But this is really, drawing these things can be more art than science, and so that is not a big deal. Okay, and then you also did a nice job with Part B, taking this information here and using it to show that we now have 3 points on her demand curve. At 3 different prices, we know how many textbooks she wants to buy. And you indicated in your email that the part you're struggling with is decomposing her buying habits into what we call the income and substitution effects. And I'm not surprised. This is really tricky, right? This is a hard thing to do. But the idea behind it is that whenever there's a change in price, there's really 2 things that change. The relative prices change. Okay, so if textbooks get more expensive, cookbooks get relatively cheaper, and textbooks are relatively more expensive relative to the other good. Okay, that's represented by the fact that the slope changed. Okay, so for instance, we were here, and now the slope changes. Oops, let's see if we can get that back. Okay, now we go down, let's say, to this point here, to this budget constraint, and the slope has changed, representing the change in prices. But there's also been an inward shift, okay? The inward shift is this idea that not only have the prices changed, but now that textbooks are so darn expensive, we feel poor, okay? So one thing we may do is reallocate some of our budget towards the relatively cheaper cookbooks, but we also may find that we still have to buy textbooks, and thus really what's happening is our budget's taken a hit and we feel poorer. So those 2 different effects, right? The movement that is because of the change in slope, we call that the substitution effect. We're substituting away from the expensive good towards the cheaper good. But then we also show that there's an income shift, and we call that the income effect. Okay, so we're going to try and decompose the 2. And so think of it that way, that there's really 2 things that changed. There's a slope change and a shift. So we want to isolate the impact of the slope change and isolate the impact of the shift. So what we need to do is we need to, let's see if I can do this, to decompose it. I don't know if it's going to let me select that line. No. Anyway, we need to take another line that is exactly parallel, so that represents the changes in price, but keep it out here at her old utility level, okay? So this blue line is parallel to the new budget constraint. However, it's what she would do if the prices changed and somehow she was able to retain the buying power that she used to have, right? Remain equally as well off as she was when things were cheap. Okay, so this new blue line is kind of imaginary. It never happens. It was never the case that the prices changed and she got like income to compensate her for the fact that the prices changed. But it's an exercise that allows us to isolate how much of her buying habit change was because of the relative price shift. Okay, so now we say if she had been able to remain equally as well off, okay, it looks like, oops, let's do something other than white. There we go. It looks like she would have purchased around here. It's really tiny. Let's see if I can make it bigger. There we go. Okay. So what I'm doing here is looking for the point that is on her old indifference curve, but tangent to this new slope. Okay. And so this intermediary spot, I don't know what they call it in the textbook in the answer key. I'll just label it like X. Okay. This is it never actually happens, but it shows that she would have changed just because of the relative change in the prices. She would have gone from B to X. So that's the substitution effect. Okay. We've isolated the impact of the price change apart from the income hit that she took. So now this parallel jump in from X down to A, this isolates the income effect. Okay? So what we can do is for textbooks, we see that going from 60 to, in this case, it looks like, let's say about, what's that, probably about 45 or so. I'll just call that 45. Okay, so going from here to here, we will call that the substitution effect. And the remaining drop from 45 down to 30, we're going to call that the income effect. In this case, the way we've drawn it, both the substitution and the income effect lead her to purchase fewer textbooks. Okay. However, it is not always the case that that happens, because sometimes an income effect can actually cause you to purchase more of something. And that's when you have what's called an inferior good. So in this case, textbooks are a normal good, right? Less income causes you to buy less of it. But for some goods, like we often talk about ramen noodles being inferior, sometimes you may find that the income effect is actually positive. Okay, so hopefully that helped a little bit. If it didn't, let me know. Happy to go over it again. It's tricky. I think I told you in the email, my students begged me not to put income and substitution effects on the videos, or sorry, on their tests. And they're tricky here even in videos. So the reason it's important, the reason we kind of harp on this, is that we're really trying to understand consumer behavior here and isolate why they make the decisions that they do.